feel free to turn your camera off. Also, please be sure to mute your mic. There will be time for a Q&A at the end. And also feel free to drop any questions you may have in the chat throughout this webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and toss it over to Annie Stroud, who will start the presentation.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. This is number 4 of our webinar series. Very excited to have you all here. I have Ashley here to share some of her knowledge. A little bit about Generation West Virginia. Generation West Virginia is a statewide nonprofit that has a whole bunch of different programs focused on ensuring that young West Virginians have the skills and opportunities to access well-paying careers in the Mountain State. We have the Career Connector, which both serves as a job board and a resume bank, so folks can get help trying to find employment in the state. We have a great fellowship program, great opportunity for young professionals in the state. We have New Force, which is a data analytics training program. And then we also have a broadband program, which is what brought us all here today. So why broadband? You know, across the state, we realized broadband is very much essential for baseline for any economic development or career opportunities in any location, right? It's essential for closing the digital divide. It helps provide access to education, career opportunities, increased healthcare, and the opportunity for economic growth. There's kind of two different pieces of that that we work on. One is infrastructure. You know, West Virginia still has a huge digital divide just in terms of access to broadband in general, with over 29% of households lacking fixed broadband availability. This is hopefully changing here shortly, but at the moment we still have a high number of households that don't have any access to high quality broadband. And then there's also broadband adoption, which is, you know, answering the question of once there is high-speed broadband available, how do we then make sure that our residents have what they need to be able to connect to the online world? So, you know, currently, based on a recent American Community Survey, 19% of our population reported not using the internet at all. And what I think is really indicative to me is upwards of 36% reported not using a PC or a tablet, which, you know, indicates that most of their interaction with the online world is just on a mobile device, which severely limits what folks are able to do. Next slide. So what we do, again, we focus on these two kind of different pieces of broadband access. The actual infrastructure, we have wraparound technical assistance. We're able to provide engineering, project development, grant writing, a lot of partnership development to help bring those projects and get them across the finish line. That's actually where we've worked a lot with Ashley in the past, so we're really excited to bring her back around for this. The other section, again, is the digital access, broadband adoption work. We've done research and planning. We worked with 18 counties across the state to do county level digital equity plans, really looking at the needs, the challenges, and potential solutions based on local conditions on the ground. We also have wraparound technical assistance there for, again, grant writing, subject expertise, project development support. We also kind of play a role, I think, in education and network building among folks looking at this. You know, we are a small state, and a lot of the organizations that are best set up to work with the folks that need the most help may or may not have the capacity to spend time finding the right outside resources. So we really are trying to bring folks together. We have educational events like these webinars. We facilitate the 18 county steering committees, and also work with folks on subject matter topics of interest based on what project development are. So very excited about all of that. All right, so I'm going to pass this over to Lucas. That's a little bit about us, and he's going to introduce our speaker for the day.
Well, today we have Ashley Badesch from who is a grant writer and partner with Sustainable Strategies DC. She is currently based in Denver. She works closely with local governments and nonprofits to secure federal, state, and philanthropic funding that advances key community priorities. She also brings a deep expertise in broadband infrastructure funding and has helped numerous clients navigate the grant landscape to support digital equity and connectivity goals. She holds a Juris Doctor from Georgetown University Law Center, magna cum laude, as well as a Master of Public Policy and Environmental Policy, and also has a BA in Spanish with a minor in philosophy from the University of Virginia. So please give it up for our guest speaker.
Thanks so much, Lucas. I appreciate the introduction, and thanks, Annie, as well. And you can go ahead and move to the next slide. So as discussed, we're going to talk today about how to craft a winning broadband access grant application. We'll touch as well kind of throughout on how the landscape is different right now than what it has been when we've been working on these in the past. But I think what I'm hoping to communicate is our sort of tried and true grant development strategy that we kind of co-developed, actually, Generation West Virginia, working with some funding from the Benedum Foundation on the locally driven broadband grant initiative. So over a handful of years, we were able to secure over $50 million in federal broadband grant funds to leverage into communities, as Annie was mentioning, that will provide high-speed broadband access to 33,000 plus individuals across West Virginia. So we had some really exciting success in securing broadband funds. And I think hopefully there will continue to be opportunities to do that moving forward. And this presentation is really targeted at any sort of broadband access grant application at kind of federal and state level, similar formula for success on developing these types of grants. So we're going to cover evaluating threshold criteria for the grant, which is actually something, especially for broadband access grants, that takes up a good chunk of time. So there's some complexity to figuring out kind of whether your grant or whether your project actually meets all of the criteria for the grant that you're looking at. So that's what we'll cover first. And then the next step is shaping the scope and the budget for the project. So this is identifying, what the project map is going to look like, if it's a fiber deployment project, how many households you're going to serve, and exactly how much that's going to cost. And then finally is developing the compelling narrative for the project. So this is pulling in the stories of how the project's going to impact your area and backing those stories up with strong data. Okay, so a couple of areas that you have to look into when you're evaluating whether you are eligible for the threshold criteria for grant applications that you're looking at. And I've got another slide that'll of examples of the types of criteria that come up, but something that for every grant that you are considering, you need to look at who is actually an eligible applicant, because it's different across all different grant programs, whether you have to be a public entity to apply, or some broadband grant opportunities will allow ISPs, the broadband providers, to apply, and some require a partnership between a public entity and an ISP. But it's important from the get-go that you ensure that you are an eligible applicant to apply, and kind of look through the notice of funding opportunity to make sure of that before you dive into working on the grant. Another thing that, especially at the federal level, becomes a threshold criteria for your ability to apply is your access to federal accounts. So this is login.gov, grants.gov, sam.gov. Most counties will have these set up, as well as your regional planning and development organizations and local governments as well. Providers sometimes won't have federal accounts set up, and occasionally local partners are also their accounts could be expired, and these accounts take a long time to set up, and they also take a long time to reboot if they happen to expire. So this is also something that you want to take a look at on the very front end of considering applying to something, is ensuring that your applicant who is eligible has all of the federal accounts set up that you might need. Same goes for state accounts, and some state accounts will require the federal accounts, or state grants will require that you have these federal accounts set up if it's federal funds that are being administered at the state level. So this is just one of those threshold things that you want to look into right away and start working on quickly if you don't have everything all set. Then a really key threshold criteria for your ability to apply for broadband access grants in particular is whether the project area that you're looking at meets the criteria for unserved and underserved. These definitions also vary across grant programs. So they went from being sort of 25 over 3 megabytes per second for a lot of programs to increasing that threshold. But it depends on what grant you're looking at. So if you're looking at sort of USDA grants, then what they consider served is really on those like slow side of the service levels. Versus there's other programs now that if you're below 100 over 20 megabytes per second, then you may be in that sort of unserved, underserved area. And then on the flip side of that, they have minimum standards of what will be considered served once you've completed the project. So you have to make sure that what you're able to deliver is going to provide fast enough service that you are eligible for the grant program as well. So this is something that, if you're applying as a partner of an ISP, you've got to work closely with the ISP to determine, what type of service they'll be able to deliver, what they're planning to deliver with, fiber optic or otherwise, and you'll have to use the maps, which we'll go over on the next slide, to ensure that you're not actually considered served. And we'll talk about this more as well, but there are areas that in practice, people who live there, people who work there know that they're served, but the federal maps might say otherwise. And then there's some opportunity for you to sort of challenge that and still be able to apply. But we have run into several times kind of surprising situations where we're presuming that an area that is in practice pretty unserved will be unserved for the purposes of the grant. And that's not always the case. Sometimes you see that other entities have secured grant funding that makes that area essentially served, even though they haven't actually deployed fiber there. And so sometimes there are ways to challenge that as well. But I think this particular element of evaluating whether you meet the threshold criteria is one that takes a good amount of effort in terms of looking through the maps, working with partners, and just ensuring that what you're applying for really criteria. And that it's an opportunity as well to reach out to the grant contacts for the funding organization and sort of run your project by them if they're willing to do that, to ensure that you're meeting their criteria before you go through all the effort of applying. The other area that is often sticky and tricky for rural communities that are applying for broadband grants is match requirements. So often the federal and state grants that you're applying to might have, a 20% required match. The match amount can vary. Under EDA grants, you might be looking at a 1-to-1 grant match. And there's a lot of different ways to meet those match requirements, including you can sometimes pass off the match requirement to the ISP, to the private sector, and say, even if you don't have that cash in hand, that if we get this funding to build out this broadband, then the ISP that's going to benefit and profit ultimately is also going to be able to put up 20% of the project cost for broadband deployment as match. So that's something that we have worked out on a lot of the grants that we put together, is kind of figuring out if the local or community partners that want to pursue funds don't have the match in hand, what are the ways that we can do to get to the point that we can make that match requirement, and can we leverage, some grants you can have a state grant match a federal grant. They're under the ARC program. Uniquely, we've been able to match federal funds with federal funds, but it's something that takes a lot of time to figure out on the front end, and it's something that is time sensitive. It's one of the items that you want to take a look at first so that you can ensure actually make the match work before proceeding with the rest of the grant. Some of the grants require that you have quite a lot of design already done, like engineering and design and technical specifications for your broadband projects before you apply. So this is something that you want to look into and figure out if there's an opportunity to complete the level of design and engineering if you don't have it when you're evaluating whether you want to pursue the grant by the time the grant is due. And there have been some resources available to sort of help, Generation West Virginia can provide some technical assistance and perhaps work on helping you work with your regional planning councils as well to figure out how to get the design to the level that's necessary before applying for these grants. Some of these programs have economic distress elements as well. The area that you're applying for has to meet certain income criteria to be eligible, and sometimes that economic distress criteria can also impact your match levels, depending on the program that you're applying to. So this is something that we'll look at the mapping tools as well for helping to figure out if you will meet those economic distress criteria. Many rural communities in West Virginia do meet these criteria, but it's always worth looking at to make sure that you're applying for something that you actually meet those threshold criteria to apply for. And if you have an area with high levels of economic distress, you may be eligible for a match waiver or a smaller match requirement. So it's important to look at this on the front end of applying for the applications as well. And then some additional requirements crop up for a lot of these grant programs that you want to be sure to look at on the front end. That can include, some of these grants want you to be serving community anchor facilities. So they want to see service go to a library or a hospital or a university or a college, what have you. And so you want to be sure to determine if your project will encompass the properties that are required for the grant. Many of them require that the network that you're building is sort of public access, that ISPs could dip into the fiber that you're building and build off of that. And then some of them also require really kind of robust financial documents. So if you've got an ISP applying, we have run into challenges before with pulling together the sort of pro forma financial documents and all of the budget documents that they want to see. Sometimes ISPs don't want to provide these for like confidentiality reasons. So this is all the stuff that you want to tackle up front. And I know this has been a long and tedious slide, but that kind of mirrors what this actually looks like in the process of determining whether you can apply. You've got to hit all of this from the very beginning before you can even jump into the grant application itself. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Lucas. So just some of the sample threshold requirements that you might see. And just to note that, all of these programs are programs that I wish I had good information on. They'll be out and available. These are programs that you could be applying to this year. All of these are currently pretty uncertain in terms of what is happening under the current administration. They're all under review at the federal level. We've continued to hear that the ARC Power grants hopefully will be coming out soon, that the EDA grant programs are going to keep rolling. There's a lot of questions around what's going to happen with BEAD and some of the USDA resources. And unfortunately, despite tracking all of these programs pretty closely, I don't have any answers as to kind of when we might expect to see these programs. I will say that heading into the budget reconciliation process that funds a lot of the federal programs coming up, now is the time to talk to your members about the need for these grant resources, so that hopefully these programs that are kind of the core broadband access programs, will become available for funding again this year and next year. That said, some of the threshold requirements to pay attention to: USDA Reconnect is a resource that we have tapped for a handful of communities in West Virginia. It's got to be rural areas, and you have to meet USDA's definition of rural. A lot of West Virginia meets these definitions, and you got to be lacking 100 over 20 megabytes per second service. And then they want to see demonstration of financial sustainability of your project beyond the grant period. EDA, you have to show that there's job creation and economic development benefits to the project that you're putting together. So this means that you would want to be able to serve that, or demonstrate that the project will serve small businesses, jobs. Actually, under EDA, they're even looking for kind of like manufacturing elements. So this would be a resource that you would be looking at if your project is going to be serving a big new factory or facility or area that would benefit from broadband that has significant job creation and regional economic development benefits. And then ARC prioritizes economically distressed counties. They've got a list of counties and they rank them according to being sort of at risk or distressed. And so you have to check where you are on that list to know what your matching requirements would be to be able to apply to ARC. And then BEAD is also looking at these unserved and underserved areas with 100 over below 100 over 20 megabytes per second. Next slide, please. So these slides, I think, will be made available. These are some of the key resources to use in this threshold analysis, and they also are the key resources that you'll use in demonstrating using data in your actual application as well. So the West Virginia Broadband Enhancement Council maps are an important resource to use to look at whether the area that you're trying to serve is considered served already, kind of what the speeds are in that area, what ISPs are operating in the area. And then USDA Reconnect has their own mapping tool, and you can look at their distress criteria. You can sort of layer those onto the map that you're looking at when you're evaluating projects for USDA. FCC broadband maps are useful as well. These ones historically have had, they've been challenged by showing areas that are receiving service or that where funding has been awarded that in practice don't actually get that service. And so you can challenge these maps with data from some of the sources that are listed below. So that's Ookla speed test data is an example of something that you can actually go out into the community or have residents provide speed test data where it's like, okay, well, if I'm actually sitting in this location and I try to access the web, I can show that the speeds that this provider says they provide here are not here. And so you can gather enough speed test data on a lot of these grant opportunities to challenge potentially FCC maps that show that your area is served, that when in fact it isn't served. And then some of these grant opportunities then allow the ISPs to come back and say, no, we do provide service there. So it can be a complex process of demonstrating that you meet the threshold of being unserved. But that Ookla speed test data is one way of showing that. And then this is the link to figuring out if your county meets the current distress criteria. It's important to note that these change every year. So you want to get on and take a look at where your project is located if you're meeting the criteria currently. And then EDA's Stats America distress tool will allow you to determine what your match level will be for EDA based on poverty levels and income data in your area. You can also use data from local and regional broadband plans that you've put together. So if you hired a consultant to put together a plan that shows that certain areas are unserved, that's a great resource for both kind of the threshold analysis and the data that you want to pull into the application when you put that together. And then the American Community Survey is a great resource for looking at income, employment, just the most sort of up-to-date information that you can find to demonstrate that you meet the criteria for the grant. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now we've gone through the whole analysis, working with your project partners, working with your ISP, taking a look at the maps, getting some technical assistance, and making sure that your project actually meets the criteria to be able to move on to the grant. Now we're going to look at shaping the scope and the budget to be competitive for the grant. So we want to shape the scope to meet grant priorities. So this is if you are sitting in a county, for example, and you've got a list of broadband projects that you want to focus on, and some of them are in really rural residential areas. That's going to be the scope that you're going to use for your like USDA rural grants versus if you've got a project that has the job creation and business opportunities, then that scope is the one that you would want to focus on for your EDA grants. It's important that you are looking at the grant priorities and shaping the scope of the project to meet those priorities. A great way to do this, as I mentioned before, is to actually set up calls with the grant contacts to discuss the scope that you're considering. So most of these federal programs and state programs are going to have a regional person that covers your region who you could draft a briefing sheet. This is the approach that we use to kind of figure out if projects are going to compete well. So put together, a one-pager about the project that has the area that you're looking to target, the speeds that you're looking to provide, the level of service that it currently gets, and then you can get on with the person from the EDA or the ARC that represents your region and talk about the scope that you want to apply for. And these calls are great because often they will help you either realize that this is not the right grant program or that maybe you want to shift the scope to be more competitive for the grant program that you are targeting by talking to the funders themselves. And then from there, you want to strategize around match. So this is what we were talking about, where if you don't have the cash in hand to meet the match requirement for a broadband access grant, then you want to be reaching out to the ISPs and the providers that might partner on the grant with you to see if they can commit to providing the match if you do win the funds. Or you want to think about, okay, if we could match this grant program against this grant program, we could get there. And that can sometimes require a little bit of a chicken or the egg dance with the funders, right? Because everybody always wants to be the last dollar in. So you sometimes have to think kind of strategically about which grant you want to go for first and how you can leverage that against the next one. You also want to secure engineers' cost estimates. So the level of detail that you have to provide on these fiber deployment grant budgets is high. So you want to be working either with your engineering team or to get the ISP to get their engineers to put cost estimates together that you can submit with the grant application to back up the cost levels that you're looking at. So that's another one of these things that you want to knock out kind of like on the early end of applying for a grant. And then you also want to be able to develop clear and simple maps of the project that show here's where the fiber is going to go. Here's all of the residences that are unserved. And the mapping tools that are available online now are really useful in helping to pull these together. And ISPs are often able to just kind of pull these maps. And a lot of your regional planning and development councils also already have great maps that they put together as part of the broadband plans that they've been working on over the years that you can pull off the shelf when you are submitting these grant applications. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so when you are putting together the scope of work and the project activities for a broadband access grant, you want to be as detailed as possible and remember that what you are providing to them is not going to be set in stone. So it's important that you provide a level of detail that is probably more than you actually know you can commit to in this moment, but you want to show them that your project readiness is really high, that you're shovel ready to go. And just remember that on the back end, a lot of things are going to change your actual project schedule, and that's okay. So you want to give them kind of the best information that you have at the highest level of detail that can even sort of exceed exactly where you are totally sure you can accomplish when you submit the grant. So I recommend breaking up the scope of work into project activities and tasks. And I've got an example of this on the next slide that I'll show you that adds specific timing and dates. So even if you're estimating, you want to be as specific as possible to scoop up all of the points in these sections. And then you want to be able to show clearly who is doing what when. So I think a lot of grants suffer in the review process from not including this level of detail, kind of talking in the third person about the activities that are going to take place, but it's not really clear who's doing what. It's not clear when the deliverables are going to be accomplished. To score high on these grants, you have to be very clear about all of these things. And then you want to ensure that your scope and activities align directly with the budget that you provided, right? So you don't want to have activities showing up in your scope, like we're going to have a broadband task force, and then not have anything in the budget that would demonstrate that, there's some personnel who are funded to run that task force. You want to make sure that those things align. And then finally, you want to include some measures of program evaluation, usually in the budget, depending on the type of project that you're working on. For instance, if you're working on like a digital literacy project, you'd want to include some metric of being able to evaluate that you've improved digital literacy through the project that you've put forward. And you can include that in the budget, shows that you're really committed to evaluating your own project. All right, next slide, please. So this is probably too small to see, and I apologize that a lot of these slides are pretty text heavy, but this is sample of the way that I break out project activities on these broadband access grant applications. You can see that, each activity is broken out as like, we're going to establish a broadband expansion task force. And then we're going to have the project initiation and management. That's going to have planning, a kickoff meeting, and developing and agreeing on our project management deliverables. And then you can see under each of those activities that I've got estimated timing. So this is like, it's going to be in the fourth quarter of 2022. And the responsible party for this activity is the Planning and Development Council and the county. So each of these activities, you can see exactly what's taking place, who's responsible, and when. And I will say that the way that this is broken out is actually essentially a sort of copy, paste, and edit job on most broadband projects. This will vary some in terms of whether you're doing like a design build or you're going to have the design done and then bid out the construction, which is the way that this one is developed here. But really having a task force together, ensuring that someone is taking charge of sort of the project management elements of the project, procuring your professional services, completing design, bidding out construction and selecting your ISP partner, and then fiber construction and this closeout. And under fiber construction, you can see, it's like mobilizing the construction contractor, routing walkout, constructing the fiber network. All of this level of detail is not going to differ that much project to project, but it will make a big difference in scooping up the points on the grant application, which is why I included it all on this slide, so that if you are putting together grant applications, you can kind of filch off of this. This is literally what, like, kind of the template that we use for most of our fiber deployment project activities, and it's the level of detail that you always want to be striving for when you're putting together kind of any sort of grant application scope of work. All right, thanks. Next slide. So then finally, we get to developing the actual narrative and pulling the data in. Narrative. So this part on broadband grants is your chance to set your project apart from other projects by telling the story of how the broadband access is going to impact your community directly. So a couple key things that you want to think about when you're developing sort of your project need section of the grant. So you want to describe your community's geography, like why is it so challenging that the private sector hasn't already put broadband where you are, right? Are you in a rural area with mountainous terrain? Are your demographics such that, folks are not going to be able to pay for the broadband without federal subsidy? What are the economic challenges that your region is facing? This narrative is going to change in framing slightly under the current administration if we see federal broadband grant opportunities than the way that we focused on framing these challenges under the last administration, but not dramatically for this specific kind of project area. When you're thinking about broadband access, you want to be talking about, the economic challenges that your community is facing because coal decline has impacted the economy of your area, because the decline in manufacturing has, impacted the economics of your area. You want to focus on describing your need and then why broadband matters. So this is the ability into online education, online job training resources, telehealth, business resources for your small businesses. And what I would say is the best way to scoop up all the points and set your applications apart in this section is to be specific, right? Think about, okay, if we provide broadband here, who are the online education providers that would serve this area? What are the online job training opportunities that these people could access? And some of those things include like what generation West Virginia provides, right? Like having broadband access allows your residents to access these job training resources, the telehealth. So you would want to look at what clinics in the region offer telehealth, or what clinics would be able to if you provide broadband, and then you those specifically. And in addition, you want to grab letters of support from any of these types of kind of community anchor institutions that are in the area. That's what's going to help really demonstrate community need here. And then you want to think about who benefits. So you want to be able to quantify the number of households, the number of businesses, the number of anchor institutions that will benefit from these resources. And then to back that up, you're going to pull in the data from all of the key sources that we touched on earlier. And I will just tell you what I do when I'm writing these community needs sections. I literally take the project map and then I walk around on like Google Earth and use Google Maps to look at exactly what is in the neighborhood. Like, what are the, is there a farmer's market that is now going to be able to market their services online? Is there even a grocery store that's now going to be able to access like online kind of management tools and things that they haven't been able to access before? Certainly, if your area is a tourism focused area, you want to be talking about how your tourist attractions are going to be able to market better, that you're going to be able to have mapping tools that would allow people to kind of use their phones to experience heritage tourism or recreation in your area. Those are all the things that you want to pull into this section. Okay, next slide, please. And then they're always going to ask for applicant experience. So this is another one that sort of just has a formula that you can follow to get all of the points. So this is asking, like, how do we know that you're going to be able to spend this money in a fast way, that you're going to be able to meet all the benchmarks that you've indicated within the grant. So you want to list any past grants that you've managed that have been successful projects, similar magnitude. So you want to say, you know, the town of Speedy has a strong track record of managing federal grants, including, and list all of those grants. If your applicant doesn't have this lengthy track record of managing federal grants, then you want to see if any of the partners that you're working and you would want to list their experience there. So especially for West Virginia, this would be your regional planning and development councils, right? You want to engage them in your broadband projects, and then you would be able to refer to their experience in managing federal grants to demonstrate that your project will be successful. You want to assign someone as like the grants manager and grant administration person for the grant. So you want to show that you know, someone from your finance department is going to take the lead on administering the grant. If you don't have, so this is kind of what I said earlier, but if you don't have like really specific information, you can say things like, Mr. Blank will serve as the project manager and will work with the Regional Planning and Development Council to undertake grant administration and reporting. The project team will follow a detailed project schedule with established workflows to ensure efficient expenditures of funds. It's pretty, you know, you could copy paste this. This is what they're looking for. So these are the types of things that you want to hit on. And then there's also specific audit language for federal grants that I've dropped in here, that if you've not been subject or you've never had an adverse audit finding, you want to include this language basically to indicate that you've not had adverse audit findings in managing federal funds before. Okay, next slide. And then you want to back up your narrative with support letters. So this would be from local businesses, schools, churches, entrepreneurs, residents, medical providers, whomever. And I've dropped in as well are the template support letter that I use for kind of building out support letter templates to send around. The best way to ensure that you get the type of letters that you're looking for is to put together a template that allows people to sort of select from the options that you're hoping that they'll say. So you'll want to like fill out all of the information about, you know, I support this project. I am this type of organization. This is what I do in the community, and I support the project because broadband access is going to allow me to market my business online, or broadband access is going to allow me to access telemedicine and not have to drive 40 minutes or more to reach the health clinic. Those are the types of things that you want to sort of like build into your letter template so that people think about, okay, yeah, this is why I support the project. And then you can collect those letters of support. Okay, next slide, please. And so in summary, you want to confirm you meet all of the threshold criteria before you get into grant drafting, and you want to allow some time to do this. Okay, so you can't wait until 2 weeks before the deadline of the grant to be figuring out if your project aligns. We have pushed a lot of these grant schedules very tight, and sometimes that's just what happens. But just if you can get ahead of analyzing threshold criteria, do, and then shape a realistic, fundable project with a clear budget before you kind of move on to the grant narrative. And then you want to build a compelling, human-centered narrative that's backed by specifics and strong data from the resources online, as well as just knowing what the project is actually going to do for this neighborhood, this community, this business, whatever. And then you want to use the trusted kind of grant specific data sources for maximum credibility. Okay, that is, I think, my last slide. And I would be happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Nothing at all. Everybody knows everything they need to know about writing broadband sounds like. All right, you can come off mute if you want to, or drop them in the chat. If not, and feel free to interrupt if I'll go through this. And if you've got something or something comes up, please drop it. So again, how do I start? Again, if you have a project idea, maybe you've done some, in an infrastructure grant, done some engineering, you already have kind of a scope of the budget that you're thinking and have your partners, you might be ready just for straight grant writing. If you're not there yet, or you have an idea and you want to start looking, that's where we can really come in and help, especially with the wraparound technical assistance pieces around project development support, asset mapping, finding partners, engineering, all of those pieces that kind of go into making a project. The QR code on the screen there does take you to our technical assistance request form, which you can fill out, and feel free to share with others. You can also find it on the website. Page. And I'll pass this back over to Lucas to kind of close us out here.
All right, so this top slide, this is just about the state's capacity subgrants and the workforce grants. Like Annie and Ashley said, these are kind of in limbo right now. We don't know the specifics on them, but when we do find out that information, we will be sure to share it with you. Just a little bit of a note on terminology. So the term digital equity has been used for many years to describe the goal of creating the conditions where all residents have equal access to online resources. While the definition of this term most accurately describes the work, due to recent policies put forth by new administration, we will likely see these words described as other things such as digital opportunity, digital adoption, broadband adoption, or other terms like closing the digital divide. But regardless of the words used, the need still remains. So it is crucial that digital equity and broadband access initiatives continue to prioritize accessibility, affordability, and inclusivity for all. And then finally, so some things that are happening next for us here at GWB. You can apply for our technical assistance, like Annie said, for broadband infrastructure and adoption projects. Our next webinar, our final one of this series, will be on May 20th. It's on sustaining success. It's about grant management and reporting requirements. Next up, the American Connection Corps is looking for new host sites and members. So if you know anybody interested in joining American Connection Corps, I highly recommend it. Applications are open now. Member applications will be open till the beginning of August. So if they're interested, please have them go ahead and fill out. And then finally, we are having our first ever workforce conference this year. It's called Pathways to Progress. It's going to be on May 8th. It's in Charleston, West Virginia. If you're interested, you can follow the QR code to register. If not, it's also on our website as well. And then to close this out, here is mine and Annie's contact information, Generation West Virginia's contact information, and a nice little QR code to subscribe to our GWV newsletter, because that's one way to stay up to date on all things Generation West Virginia and also things happening across the state as well. I think that's pretty much it. So does anybody have any questions for me, Annie, Ashley? Now's your time.
Right. Hearing none, I think we'll wrap that up. Thank you again, everybody, for hopping on today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.